art lies within the artist and is the knowledge by which things are made. Such are the words of Ananda Kumar Swami, who speaks from the time of a heady modernism. We also have Rushdie, who suggested that there is always a migration, the migration of ideas into images. And so we have Unsealed Chamber, for contemporary artists looking at the transient image.
Over the years, how I played multiple roles, and there's always I'm always looking outside, because I'm multiple things, multiple people. I'm a daughter. I am taking care of my parents over the last many years.
It takes close to 8 hours to make each salt print, and just sitting with each of these women, I kind of felt more closer to them, image-wise. Yeah.
I look at like collective repositories of our memory, in which we commemorate together and we learn together and we display collective discourses.
Printmaking as a method of working, as a method of art practice, it always invites new challenges, new technology. It's linked with the industry, and not only to create a kind of an image for industry, but artistic image which been supported by the industrial methodology, industrial processes.
The idea of wanting to make two bodies of work also came from addressing the concept that I'm exploring, which is my skin and my body, in a very performative way. So by making it performative, I'm also addressing what's on my mind. So I'm actually projecting it outward in a form that I feel most comfortable with, because when I think back, and why am I talking about the body as a site of all the experiences that I have, there are only some of them that I'm able to talk about, but there are some which I can't. They're too hard or too difficult for me to talk about. So maybe for me to sort of bring that out in a very physical way, I like the comfort that it gave me, to be able to project it outward. So the starting point to wanting to make both these pieces was that. So when I'm making the images, initially I was very uncomfortable. It took me, the first day I was very uncomfortable because I wasn't sure, should I ask someone, because the self-portraits, what does it mean for me to shoot myself, to make images of my own self. But as I got into the process of doing it, it sort of became so intimate, and I just absolutely loved being in that moment of creating those images. I made those prints. Now those prints need a home. I need to want to put them in sort of a box to sort of give them a home. They speak to each other. They can't be shown, they can't be framed individually. They're in their naked form. I'm not framing them because I want them as they are, each print. But each print talks to the other print. Just the visual aspect of it for me didn't feel like there was enough that I was saying. I had so much more to say. And because it was, I thought it was performative, even the way I was doing the self-portraits, sort of naturally led to the idea of actually physically presenting something which adds another layer, which is distinct on its own, yet is actually talking about the same thing. So maybe a little perspective, you're standing in two different places and looking at the same thing. The shift in perspective, because the visuals are very, very intimate. They're absolutely close. There's no room for, it's actually breathing that close. And the video is sort of taking it very far. So the perspective, even for me in my mind, is a different one. there is the really intimate close-up view, but I'm also able to step back, sort of look at it, So for me, I'm able to separate myself also at that same time.
The project was not even Ivar initially. The name Ivar in Malayalam means people in your home, in a closer vicinity. The project started with Aval, as to her, who is at a distance, And I've been collecting photographs of women, especially from a really, really long time. I think it's been one of the first photographs came home, I think, in 2008. And it came when I went to a kabadiwala, and then he said, I saw an image of a woman lying on the floor of his shop. And I asked him, who is that? And he said, people are very dispensable these days and things like that. And then the conversation, for me was like, I will take her home. And then, I think from then onwards, I've been like continuous finding of these photographs. And then I started building a collection at home. Not in a very conscious manner, but wherever I went, and if I would find these images, I was exhibiting at the Kochi Biennale, and I remember going to find a certain kind of bed that I needed to put for the installation, and I went to the shop, and again there were like a lot of these photographs that were lying around, and I think that's where it all just started. It just came together many years together, and having like I think close to 400 photographs I think in the collection for now, and I didn't know what to do with it. And there were also images that I would put up on the wall at home, right next to where I would pray in the morning. And I would pray to all these women, like, whoever you are, just please take care of me, kind of thing. And then I think we started experimenting with salt prints at Känike, and then we were like, this seems like an interesting medium to explore this project with, salt having this idea of it as a preservative, but doesn't preserve for long. So in a way, it was me trying to hold on to them, these photographs of these women. But I know that, in some way they were abandoned and the memories faded, I guess. So that's when I started stitching the borders with my hair, because hair for me is this metaphor for memory. And eventually salt print has this ephemeral quality of it disappearing in front of your eyes, right? And for me, that became quite interesting, of how, who were these women who were abandoned, and how did they come and they would just vanish again in front of you during the course of the exhibition. And for me, it was also very important to use black salt, because that was a salt which apparently in earlier Ayurveda had this quality of curing hysteria, which resonated with one of the photo studio owners telling me that how they would not let any of the women especially smile, because that kind of said that you're not okay, there's something wrong with you. So, so all these like just fell in together and worked out really well to start making these products. Salt prints. It started with 2, which was exhibited during being in a state of salix, to today sitting on close to 83, out of which 33 were like failures. But just sitting with each of these women, I kind of felt more closer to them, image-wise.
And I was here in Bangalore struggling to have a small space for myself that I could set up. And then in the process, I think Indu was also looking for a space, a separate space where she could practice her art. And we began discussions, and I stumbled upon this house available for rent. And then we both thought it was a good place to begin.
I think that's why the lens-based practice that we have here is also very much analog in nature, and is kind of concentrating on historical process, which is very much touch and feel. I think there was this idea of like having a little bit of digital fatigue, where we were moving away from actually doing things with our hands. And that really translated into where we were as a space, which was important for us, what we were doing, and connecting with people on one-on-one.
Hi, I'm Krishanu Chatterjee, and I have been practicing photography for past 10 years on, and commercially I was doing quite a bit of work, and after a certain point of time around 2016, 17, that time, I was feeling little boredom with this similar kind of commercial work, and I needed something more, and then I was thinking what more can be done, and by then the film photography had quite simmered down. So I was reading, and then suddenly I came across the whole idea of alternative printing and wet plate collodion. When I came and started working together, then I found it's very interesting because the moment you do something, you have already 3 more critics for you, and that is what is interesting for me to be part of a collective.
My name is Philippe CALIA. I'm an artist based out of Bangalore. I started my practice in India only, in Bombay, where I was living for about 10 years. I did a project there in 2016, 2017, where I was working with a collection of images that belonged to a certain community who lived in Bombay itself. As I said, it started in France during the residency, because at that time, I tried experimenting reactions of different chemicals on different papers. I was going back to working more specifically on a technique, but I had no clue exactly what I was doing. I know I was more and more though concerned by the question of memory from a personal point of view also. I mean, a social reality, but that concerns our personal archive. I think I started experiencing a little bit of a vertigo when I realized how much I could do just with my own mobile phone, how much I could go back into my past. When I got stuck at home during the first wave, I decided to continue exploring that technique with different recipients, different ways, different quantities of chemical. I developed a project with the form in mind before the story, basically. Working with chemicals or working with an analog process is that in the end, it leaves a room for chance and accident and discovery through that process also. I had made an image almost unreadable and too abstract to be actually identifiable. But because of the indexicality of the medium, because of its ontological nature, I was kind of allowed, to play with language and the captioning and retain a veracity of information, in that work. And that interested me, the fact that the image had taken a different shape, but something had been preserved, in where it was taken. So the coordinates and above which place in the world, it was taken. Eventually, this technique means destroying images, means washing away inks from paper. So it's going from starting from image to nothingness, and some kind of void.
the idea of migration and shifting rather from one place, their native villages to the city is probably the most important crisis of our own time. The development of city, the crowded cities, and they're living their own villages. So two things were happening simultaneously in a social and economical periphery. This creates a kind of an imbalance in the society. So this was the core area, and I wanted to translate the whole thing into the medium, or the history of the medium rather. Click the panorama of the spaces where I was acquainted with, and the spaces, the important places of the villages, the common place of a village where all people gather together in a space. So these spaces been documented through that. So that was one idea at certain point of time. Then I did it with Wycliffe Clodion negatives as well as the paper negatives. Then I thought, I've collected family albums, photographs from family albums, then printed on the found object like broken tiles from the houses. And there were also images that where I've been documenting my own space. So from villages where I shifted and which became my place. So this new space is also need to be documented with that temporality of it. So I documented it with silver gelatin negatives on glass plates, and then I started working with it with the fragility of it. So you can see this textures which is coming out. You can see this this frilling which has been considered that okay, these are the defects of negatives, which have been embedded as a texture. Which also give you a kind of a sense of temporality into it, organic forms into it. So I use it intentionally, and then I enlarge it so that that amplifies the whole thing. And then I printed it on a gum bichromate print. But so the new space been printed like that way, been approached to that way. I used charcoal as a body of the paint. That is also intentional because that's the basic component of nature. So these are the underlying elements which are into it. Shantinitan has a very specific idea about education, about living, about your life pattern, which is, I think, which has a very significant role to play on life of us who lives here. At certain point of time, the idea of Pan-Asian was more important than being an Indianness. So there was no idea of Indianness against the colonial power. There was an idea of Pan-Asian structures. So Tagore, the Tagore's family, the philosophers of his contemporaries, they were looking for a Pan-Asian structure rather than protesting against Western influences or a colonial structure. There was direct influences from Indonesian Java batik to Shantiniketan. The art forms directly, the craft form came directly. There were influences of Chinese artists, Japanese artists, in terms of architecture, in terms of carpentry, in terms of furniture designing. And the same thing is happening simultaneously in Bauhaus and here. So these were the phenomena which shaped the whole idea of it. And why I'm mentioning this Pan-Asian repeatedly, because that's the philosophy which talks about that you reject your immediate society and then you leave, you develop yourself, you self-realize yourself.
Just a word overall with respect to the sort of the curation of artists. I think the range in media across all the different artists was something it was a great starting point to start thinking about what space could look like, just because the idea that each space could fundamentally look different was a thing that sort of emerged from the work of the artists themselves. For example, with Arpan's space, the idea that all of this is happening on paper, all of these are happening using certain traditional printing processes, but at the same time there is experimentation in them. That is sort of where the idea of the atelier was sort of born. With Philippe, I think fundamentally because the video work is sort of the central piece of his space. The challenge, but at the same time the advantage of the opportunity really to build a black box space in this gallery, like I've mentioned, was not a traditional gallery space. Both parts of his work need to speak to each other, but have very different requirements spatially. with Indu, I think what was interesting to hear from you is how she conceives of the images tilt a certain way, and there's the intention of it is sort of like an altar, it's sort of like a sacred space. So hence I guess that the idea that it has to be a space that's intimate, it has to be a space that is sort of contained and feels safe or feels peaceful in a way. And finally with Aparna, I think each individual piece is it varies in medium, they're all individual artworks in themselves that also require their own space, but at the same time they're like right at the entrance. So we're also trying to navigate how people are going to engage with this, because they're entering the gallery and you also want people to pause for a moment and engage with these artworks. So yeah, I mean hers was I still feel it was a bit of a challenge to work around with that, to give each of these artworks space where the visitor can sort of be with them, but at the same time not feel the urgency of being in the entrance space and hence sort of move on very quickly. So I think which is why that space has sort of intentionally been kept, like artworks are placed far apart from each other.
And there are many questions the exhibition asks. Can there be an event in the absence of a witness? Can there be testimony in the absence of a listener? Do photographs reverse the flow of recollection? Do they block memory? Do they become counter-memory? And eventually, what do photographs engage? What do they release within the viewing experience? Why is it so unsettling to navigate the chasm between the fixed photographic self and the living experiential self? What is the human capacity to remember? How do we without the support of visual artifacts? And is it truly impossible to remember something without reference to a corresponding internal or external image?